good morning, good afternoon, good night, depending on the time you're watching this. For our guests, we're trying traveling, just so you know, Science Beach. We have to talk about this. For me, right now it's 5 p.m. For our guest, Steve Lieber, on the other side of the screen, it's 8 a.m. So first of all, hello, Steve, and thank you so much for making it so early in the morning for you.
This is not normal for me. This is not natural. Got coffee ready to go here. So
see, you have your morning coffee. I have my after lunch coffee here. I have to work coffee. How's things? How's things going in your neck of the woods? Are they getting better? It's still crazy with all that. How's things from in the Portland area?
For the past year, I've been happy talking, saying, "Oh, we're doing really well." I'll be honest, it's not great. My friends and I have mostly hung in there, but it's been rough. I've shared a studio with 20 artists for more than a decade now at Helios, where you visited, and all these good friends. I've barely seen them in 13 months, and I miss them a lot. And also, you may have heard one of our studio mates died this week.
Yeah, so sorry about that. My condolences.
So we've all been scrambling and trying to deal with that and help out his widow. Mm-hmm. So sorry to start things off with the bummer, but that's where my mind is. So folks should be aware.
Yeah, I mean, makes absolute sense, of course. Do you know where you guys are going to be able to get back together in Helioscope at the studio, or not idea yet?
We're starting to. I'm fully vaccinated. About 7 or 8 others are fully vaccinated. But the first thing that's going to happen is people are going to have to move stuff back into the room, because over the past year, folks have gone, and every day you take one thing out. Oh, I need this monitor. I need this piece of equipment. I need these books. So everyone's going to have to move their stuff back in, and then get used to using it again.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Plus, everyone got just terrible haircuts.
But you know, I have a really good advantage on that. You know, I just need a same machine, and I guess you know, some Dovson doesn't have problems either because he's in the same situation. So we're covered. Some of us are covered. So you guys, and your haircut doesn't look that bad. You're fine.
Oh, that's good. Yeah. I've had my first. I went last week and got my first live haircut since February of 2020.
Wow.
Prior to that, it was just me kind of guessing where I should cut things, and I looked like a mental patient. It was terrible.
Well, everybody did, you know, to excuse you, that's good here, because everybody did for the last year, except us bald people who, for the first time ever in the history of the world, have been able to say, you know what, fuck off, we don't have those problems. Yeah. But the rest of you is like, yeah, my hair. Now we are like, yeah. So sad for you. What is this? Okay, imagine my name is Dr. Victor Frankenstein. I'm your doctor now. This roasting pen is my syringe. You know, you've been vaccinated, but imagine that I just vaccinate the rest of the world. You know, everything is fine. The pandemic is over. What's the first thing? And cutting your hair doesn't count because you've already done it. So what's the first thing that you've been dying to do for the past 13, 14 months that you could do the moment you're released into the wild?
To sit inside a good restaurant. It's simple, yeah. To have a long meal, a long dinner with a bunch of friends inside, that would be wonderful. After that, travel. I'd love to get in an airplane and go somewhere. And beyond that, these are just such wild, insane dreams. I haven't dared to think about them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Do you miss conventions at all?
Yes and no. I miss talking to friends. I miss meeting fans. I miss sketching and looking at artists' portfolios and all the human contact parts of it. I don't miss I don't miss the middle seat on an airplane,
Huh.
and yeah, and dealing with the hotel that's lost the packages full of books I've mailed them, and um, and uh, getting the flu from being in a room with 10,000 people and all that stuff.
Yeah.
Um,
This is one of the things that I keep talking to people about. Is the numbers in Spain with the flu. I think they've gone from maybe 100 whatever, like 1,600 whatever a year, and they said the numbers a couple of weeks ago, and it's like 18. And you are like,
wow.
okay, so maybe that about having the mask on during the during the winter,
Yeah.
as the people in Asia used to do, is not such a bad idea to keep that in mind, and during the 3 winter months to keep using the mask. In fact, my family and are talking about, my wife and myself are talking about, I think we're going to keep doing it during the winter months, because that shows, that if you use it, if you wash your hands, if you clean, that those measures, the risk to get infected by whatever each month less, right?
Absolutely.
Mhm. What is the part of, we're talking about conventions? What is the part that you miss the most? The contact with the fans, or just hanging around with friends that you don't see, or maybe see once a year? Or the part that I love the most, which is that serendipitous moment when somebody gets into the restaurant that you weren't expected, and suddenly you start talking, and it's like you saw them yesterday, but it was like 15 years ago.
I love that. That's, yeah. Those the late night talks. The bar has never been a big appealing thing to me, because I can't hear that well, and
Mhm.
20 voices, it's hard to sort. But with 3 or 4 friends and somebody you've never spoken with before, then you get to have a real conversation, some real contact. And I love talking to young artists. One of my
Mhm.
favorite things in the world is when somebody 16, 17, 18 years old brings their portfolio to me and asks my advice, and I get to talk about what they do.
Mhm.
It's a joy. I love that. Um, I did a convention at Mexico City a couple of years ago,
Mhm.
and I I had to do a bunch of portfolio reviews speaking through a translator,
Mhm.
and um, but my translator was very good. She was dating an artist, so she knew a lot of the jargon, the technical terms. Um, and between that and making little diagrams to show quick sketches, I was able to still talk even with the language difference. And wonderful, such a pleasure.
Because in the end, is the language, the language of comics, the language of art, is much bigger than the idiomatic, than the language barrier, right? In the
Um,
end, if you know the code in a way, you can get through the artist, right?
yes, yeah, and if they're advanced enough uh, for me to be talking about serious things, then they're advanced enough to read a very quick sketch or a diagram and understand what I'm talking about.
Hmm. Absolutely. Um, of all the possibilities you had in life as an artist, why did you decide to go for the most masochistic route, which is, why did you decide to do comics?
um, I did not have a very happy childhood. I won't go into details. It wasn't great. Um, but comics were the place I could escape to.
Hmm.
I had a, a bunch of comics that I bought at junk stores, at house sales. I wasn't allowed to buy new comics; those were too expensive. Those were 35 cents, and I wasn't allowed to spend that much. But at 10 cents, I could spend. Um, and for the time that I was reading those comics, I wasn't I wasn't living in this terrible world that I was living in the rest of the time. And along the way, I started getting interested in the language of comics, and at a certain point, that I can nail that point down pretty closely. My interest shifted from the characters in the comics to the idea of how to make them. And I know the moment I was reading a reprint of the old EC comics from the 1950s. It was one of the first big treasury-sized books. The book was about this tall. It was huge. And if you could imagine me at 4 feet tall, exactly that size, yeah.
the alien size.
Imagine me as a little kid who's only ever had used comics, the normal size. To be reading this, it was really something. And I ran into a story by an artist, Bernard Krigstein, called Master Race, and it's just an 8-page story, but it's like the Rosetta Stone for advanced comic book storytelling. And I read it, and I was hearing the sounds that he was drawing. I don't know how else to describe it. If you know the word synesthesia.
Yeah, of course, yeah. I was going to ask you about that later. So that's amazing.
I'm not synesthetic. I don't have that condition. But when I was reading this comic, I heard the subway train he was drawing. I heard the sound transitions he was drawing, because he was very deliberately juxtaposing pictures of very different things that had similar sounds, and he was also cutting up and controlling time in a way that I'd never seen anyone do in comics before. He had blurs of incredibly fast motion, and he had broken time up into very slow motion. And suddenly, it's like I've been watching a puppet show all this time, and suddenly I could see the guy,
the puppeteer, yeah.
And I needed to know more. That just catapulted me forward.
And that's the part where I always say, comics for me, people relate comics to movies, and I always say I don't agree. And I want to know your opinion. I think that comics are a lot closer to music than they are to in that sense. I was talking about, I wasn't going to ask if you are synesthetic, but I always use that example of when I see colors, I always think about, and I ask colorists about it when I have them on the show, which is that, when you're thinking about the colors, and Matt Wilson confirmed he thinks that way, if you put a sound to that color. And he was like, yeah, for me, a red is an impact. A yellow is a, whoa, like be scared, it's a feeling mixed with a sound. Is that the same for you? For you, comics are more related to music and sounds that they could be to a movie in terms of what your brain feels?
Absolutely. I tend to absorb comics as story and as rhythm, and not at all as drawing or a subset of painting or film. It's about rhythm. It's about the juxtaposition of elements, and it's hard to talk about this stuff without sounding like your stoner roommate in college. At a certain point, everyone just starts waving their hands and getting big-eyed and weird. But yeah, it's about putting a loud shape next to a quiet shape. Something angular next to something flowing and rhythmic. One of the things that's propelled my work forward a lot has been trying to do as much of the how do I put this? Trying to control as much of what goes onto the page as possible. For the first 8 years of my career, I was on the assembly line. I penciled. Everybody else did their own thing, and imagine trying to be in a live band in a Zoom concert, and something like that. The rhythms never hit. When I did Whiteout with Greg Rucka. One of my rules for taking the job on, I said, okay, you're a small company, you don't have a lot of money to pay. I want to control everything that's on the page. I want to do the tones. I want to do the lettering myself. I want perfect control of that. And I think that's the reason that was the first thing I did that people liked, because finally making comics that work the way they work inside my head. And I think that's the reason.
In a way, that level of control is also about being yourself, right? Is that be true to yourself. There's moments when you, in other cases, there's artists that are completely happy, like JR and other people who are completely happy. I do the pencils and then I trust an inker who's going to do, their own thing. But in many cases, like I think it's your case, Frank Miller's and many others, the moment you start doing your own inks, the moment you start completing the work, if that's the right word for you, then is when you really become or feel you're an artist, right? Because you feel that's me on the page.
Yeah, and I certainly understand folks who like to work, who like to do just that one small part of it, and clearly someone like John Romita Jr. has a voice that's so powerful that you can hear it no matter who else is
absolutely
the thing. But with my own stuff, going to go back to the music analogy, some drawings need to be like the hit of a stick on a drum, and others need to be like a twang on a guitar with a lot of feedback, so it goes. And if you're not inking the drawing yourself, you can't control that.
Yeah, yes, but by the end of the day, it's not so much about. I love that correction. It's not so much about control than it is about the safety net, right? The safety net that gives you that that you're going to use to continue with the music. The amplifier is going to set in the right position, and when you need to put the foot on the pedal, it's your feet, so you're going to put it and control it. And if it's not your feet, somebody's going to it's going to sound like, and you're like, what? That's not what I wanted, right?
That's it, exactly.
I know it's weird. I know I just gave a weird example, but I think people are going to understand that. And in terms of comic storytelling, if I ask you, and I promise I will start with the music. For you, comic storytelling, is it jazz? Is it your rock and roll, or is it a symphony?
That's a tough metaphor to untangle. I don't think I've done anything complex enough to be a symphony. Even my longest stuff, there's not that many elements going into it. I think for a symphony, you need to be like one of those Japanese artists who's been telling a story for 10 years. So I'm a lot more like a pop song or maybe a concept album or something.
No, I normally, superhero artists tend to equate symphony with superheroes, because on the highs and lows, I could say operatic more than symphony, even, like the opera. And then most other artists, except for the Brits always say it's punk, to be honest. But the rest always tell me, which I think is the answer you are going to agree with, is it depends on the story, because depending on the story, you're going to go more into jazz, more into rock and roll, or more into opera or whatever, right? The story also tells you what direction to take as an artist.
Yeah, very much so. And it was interesting. I see one of the questions is about comedy.
Yes, hello Pedro. Hello Pedro. How are you? Says hello everyone. Your name is printed as one of the funniest moments I've read recently. How do you get the comedic tempo so well?
The answer is, well, I initially didn't know I could do comedy. Before I did Superior Foes of Spider-Man with Nick Spencer, no one had ever asked me to be funny before. I was the guy you paid when you wanted to kill any possibility of funny. it, but I've always been around funny people, and I like being funny in person. So I'd wanted to try it. I just never had a story that called for it. And as for how I do it, I do a lot of thumbnail drawings, tiny little sketches, and I do it bad 20 ways until I find the one good way. I just come up with a lot of versions that aren't funny when I find one that's funny, I say, okay, that's the one. And I got to be a much better artist by doing comedy, much better artist for everything I do, because I used to have a problem as an artist, especially as a young artist, where I felt nervous that my drawing wasn't finished enough. There wasn't enough detail, enough completion. So I would cross-hatch, and I would add an extra light source, and I would put extra bits of rendering, and just keep adding pointless, useless detail. And what I found is if I tried to draw like that when doing comedy, it killed the joke. It stopped being funny.
Yeah.
So I needed to learn, when do you stop working on a drawing? When it's funny. The moment I can look at that and say, that's funny, cool, step away. Don't touch it anymore. It doesn't matter if it feels like it's finished or not. Walk away. If it delivered the laugh, you're there.
Yeah, and that's also when you're thinking about drama, every time, it's going for the striking more detail maybe sometimes, but when you're going for a joke, as you know, I heard Billy Crystal talk about it several times, is people doesn't know how many times do you try the joke until it works. You can be in a club and 20 times it works, and the moment you realize it doesn't, it's the one time it doesn't. You're like, you know what, if it doesn't work one time, it's not going to work for the general public, so just drop it, just go again and try 24 more times. But the moment you realize it clicks, you just stop working on it and you just move toward the joke, right? So that's the same thing for process for you, I guess. The moment you see it clicks is when you realize, stop overworking it, you're going to kill the joke.
Yeah. And I'm very lucky that for most of this phase of my career, I've shared a studio with some very funny people. And I could walk across the room and I could show it to Jeff Parker. I could show it to Colleen Coover, to Dan Scotty, to Benjamin Dewey, people who are really funny themselves, and say, does this work? Does this make you laugh? And they'll contribute ideas too, which is great. Some of the best moments in Superior Foes of Spider-Man came from Colleen Coover leaning over and saying, put a big head right in the middle of that, or something. Or Benjamin Dewey, I asked, I need death traps, and Benjamin Dewey yells, clothes of Lenin mummified, and okay, and I start drawing that. And people who read the comic know exactly what I was just talking about. Yeah.
But that's also a big part. I remember when we visited you guys on Helioscope, and then we had lunch together with you guys. That's also a big part of the studio thing, that people sometimes doesn't realize. You can just be, having lunch and talking about something that is really not related to the work, but suddenly an idea because of that conversation just pops out for the work. And you're not even talking about that at lunch. You just want to, talk about whatever else. Sometimes you talk about work at lunch. That's what we do. But when you don't, you're talking about something else, and suddenly an idea just pops, and you start talking on the table, and you go back really pumped to continue working because of those ideas, right?
Yeah. Most of the time we don't talk about work because it's like fish talking about water.
Yeah.
We're in it all the time. There's nothing to say. But what we do talk about is all the ideas and all the other things that feed into the work.
Yes, absolutely. So that's something that really flows, right? That from the studio environment, what it flows is you don't need to talk about the work. That's what I meant to ask. You don't need to talk about the work for something to really affect it, right? Even if you're talking about, whales in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, that can make you think of a joke, or that can make you think about something to add on a page that wasn't going to be there, but like an extra that you're going to put in a corner for people to catch as an Easter egg, something like that, right?
Yeah.
Mhm.
That's exactly right.
Pedro also asks, how did you come up with the Peanuts scenes for Jimmy Olsen?
Matt Fraction asked for it. Matt knows that I love drawing in different styles. He knows that I love the old-fashioned kid cartooning, and that my biggest influences are Peanuts and the American Dennis the Menace, and uh, the wonderful synthesis of those things that the American cartoonist Jaime Hernandez does.
Mm-hmm.
And he knew that I was eager to try working in these different modes, and so he thought of a way for me to do it.
Mm-hmm. Do you feel that with that book you guys accomplished everything you wanted to, or you could go back in a second to go back to that book?
The book works exactly the way I hoped it would, and the way Matt hoped it would. In fact, I think it works better than we hoped it would. But we still keep coming up with jokes. We still text each other with stuff that we came up with 6 months after we finished it, 8 months after we finished it, that we should have put in, but there's no more pages. There's nowhere to use it. So all we could have done is make it bigger. But I think it's as good as we possibly could have made it.
But you could, since you guys still have ideas for it, jokes, as you said. Would you go back? Would you do a second season, or you are like, you know what, whatever, it's done. That's the story you wanted to tell. Even if we have more ideas, it could kill. It could kill what we wanted to do.
Yeah, we have more ideas. I don't think we have more story. Which is a different thing. We have what we have would be lots of things that would be great DVD extras.
Mm-hmm.
But I think anything that doesn't make a story better makes it worse.
Yeah.
So even if they're good jokes on their own, it would hurt the pacing. It would hurt the structure of it.
Yeah. So you have the jokes, but you still don't have. I mean, if you ever had it, you still don't have the story to make those jokes work, right? The context, exactly. To say it in a way.
Yeah. I'm sure Matt and I will work again. It will probably be on something that we create from scratch.
Mm-hmm.
Right. I mean, we've already done one small thing together since Jimmy. We did a short story for Greg Rucka and Leandro Fernandez for their The Old Guard series.
Mm-hmm.
Greg and Leo are doing an Old Guard anthology with different stories from the character's history. And Matt and I did a story together in that, and it's very different from Jimmy. Mm-hmm. It's 12 pages long, and there's not a laugh anywhere in there. It's serious and sad.
Mm-hmm.
And it was interesting to be that cartoonist again, because I haven't been that guy in a while.
That's true. You spent how much time? At least one year, I guess, with Jimmy, a year and a half.
Yeah.
How difficult it is for you to turn off that comedic muscle and to go back to the drum muscle? But because I guess for you as an artist, it's got to be a completely different set of muscles to focus on and to work on, right? As an artist.
Yeah. Honestly, the melodrama is easier. Melodramatic stuff, adventurous stuff, it's a lot easier to draw than comedy. If you only get 90% of the way there in an adventure story, drawing for an adventure story, it's just an exciting moment.
Mm-hmm.
If you only get 90% of the way there in a comedy, what you get is a joke that wasn't funny and people hate you.
Yeah.
Hate you and they want to see you hurt. And they get angry and they resent it. So the stakes are a lot lower in adventure comics than they are in comedy, which is one of the reasons you don't see as much comedy, because there's nothing that makes people angrier than comedy that isn't funny.
Absolutely. And that's also when you talk when you talk to actors, like Jim Carrey and the others, and they say, now for me, melodrama, is easier, and people, gets mad at them, and I always repeat, how many muscles do you have to move for a person to to laugh, and now think about how many muscles do you need to move for one person to cry. It's 1 against 130. So of course it's a lot more difficult. So for them, being in that position where if you don't get the laugh, you're fired, it's much more difficult than the other side, which is, if I don't make them cry but make them sad, it works. But the other way is you make them laugh or you make them laugh. And if they don't laugh, the movie's a failure and you're fired. So I guess it's the same, in terms of the comedy that it is in comic books, than in this of a movie. You have one try with comedy, right? And if it fails, people is going to drop the book. So for you guys, the stakes were much higher, right?
That's precisely it. Exactly.
Great Gostini, great name. Yes. Do you work traditionally or digitally? What would you say the pros and cons are of each one?
Most of my work now is digital. I'll do a final pass on a physical page. I'll do a lot of work digitally and print out the page and then finish it with a brush. If there are textures or marks that I can get better that way than I could entirely working digitally. But particularly with the comedy stuff where I have to make things, or I'm constantly playing with rhythm, I have to be able to grab things and make them smaller, make them bigger, move stuff around, try things out, move sound effects here or there. And working digitally gives me the flexibility to fine tune things. The only advantage to working on paper, well, there's two. One, there's a connection, a physical satisfaction of making an object, of dragging a brush across paper and feeling the ink catch on the little bumps. It's very satisfying. And when you're done, you have the original art, which is both wonderful to have in front of you and to be able to sell. That's for a lot of artists, it's a big part of their of how they make their living. But the flexibility that computers give you, and as I get older, being able to take a panel that's this big on the original and make it this big on the screen, it's a lot easier on old eyeballs.
Yes, we call it, I don't know how's the name in English, but in Spanish it's presbicia. Is that thing when you're getting older and older, and you need to enlarge the screen on the iPad, more and more. It's like, okay, that's nice, guided view. Now I don't use guided view, but I use my fingers to make the panel bigger in the iPad because I can't read it. So that's a part of life that makes, as an artist, having that, which we didn't have in the past, is just something that makes your career longer and it makes it easier, right?
Yeah. I mean, in the world of fine arts, I remember reading about how when he got very old, Matisse would have to work with brushes that are this long so he could paint at a distance and see what he was doing, because working close, his eyes couldn't focus.
Yes.
And I think about that kind of thing a lot.
No, by the end of the day, it's also about work safety. You know that with those machines, with those tools, and I was recommending it to, believe it or not, to Jose Luis Garcia Lopez a couple months ago. We were talking, the master of masters, and we were talking Garcia Lopez, and I was telling him, you should, try the iPad. And he was saying, oh, I'm too old. And I was like, no, just try Procreate, etc. Because for your eyesight and all that, at this stage in your life, it's going to help you much more. You're going to be able to enlarge it and all that. And he tried it and said, maybe it's not for me. Maybe I'm too old, but I understand why you're saying it. And I'm going to tell it to other friends, because by the end of the day, that is only going to help us. If you are losing sight, that thing is only the technology is going to help you to keep working, right?
Yeah, and it's also really, really nice if you're working. If I'm drawing a small panel, I have to draw it with my fingertips and my wrist, and it's hard on these.
Carpal tunnel.
Exactly. Whereas if I can take that panel and blow it up, I can draw with these big muscles in my shoulder, and it's just much healthier.
I remember. I think it was Frank. I'm not sure. I think it was Miller who told me that he started drawing because of carpal tunnel. He started drawing, standing and with a huge desk.
Yeah.
And he was like, it wasn't because of the size of a paper. It was because of that, because of the tunnel, because I could work, much more openly with my whole arm and my shoulder. And that saved me from a lot of injuries. And I have never thought about it that way. But you're like, well, of course, if you have a bigger canvas and you don't have to force your eyes or your wrist that much, of course, you're going to risk the injury a lot less, right?
Yeah. You have to take a couple of precautions when you're working that way. You have to make sure that if the panel is going to run this size, that you don't, after you blow it up, that you're not using a little tiny brush, because otherwise it's like you're sewing you're sewing in details that no one will ever see in the comic book.
Yes. John Bogdanov told me about that. He started working digitally, and Batman 666, I think it was, and the moment he got the comic, the printed comic back, he wanted to kill himself, because he was like, I spent so much time, adding details and characters to panels that are this big, that of course nobody could see them, and even worse, they look confusing. So it's like, I just, throw the iPad away, went back to my light table and said, for now on, I'm going to work back traditionally until I'm able to work digitally and not go crazy, into small panels and all those details. That's also risky, right? When you have to train your brain as an artist to know when to stop with digital, right?
Yeah, for me, the thing that I do to make it easy to not fall into that trap is I just have a little piece of tape next to on my monitor with a number right next to where you choose the size of the brush, and I don't go below that number. If I don't go below a 10 pixel brush, it'd be like I'm trying to draw with a big fat Sharpie on that little tiny drawing. And
but you select the number for each panel on the page?
No, most of my panels will all be within a pretty narrow range. 17 pixels, 20 pixels are the usual brushes. For fine details, I might go down to 10 pixels. If I'm below 10 pixels, then I'm like one of those Buddhist monks making the mandala by sprinkling sand.
No, I was asking because I know of artists who literally do that. That select and make a annotation, after reading the script and doing the layout, be it on digital on paper, and selecting the brush and having in any panel a number before they start. Okay, for this panel I'm going to use this brush, for this panel so they don't go too far into the how thick or thin it is. So that I think that's crazy. That's too much. Whoever does it, there's a reason for them. But this a bit too much, right?
Yeah, and comics has for a very long time attracted people who don't always have the most healthy relationships with these sorts of decisions. I'm being diplomatic here. But yeah, I've watched my friends make terrible decisions about how much detail and how many steps and how many levels of correction they put into things. And I've sat back and just watched their youth fly away like a bird, as they keep fixing the same page over and over. And I don't want to be that guy.
Of course.
So I try to avoid that.
Yeah, I have one of my artists who still is obsessive. You can to the unhealthiest possible point. And one time, I was like, I knew he was repeating, one head days after days, like 20 times already. He went to other pages, but he came back to that panel and he redo that head over and over again. So I just told him the next issue. I was like, when you draw the first panel, please do me a favor, scan it and send it to me. I will keep it. I won't say a word. I just kept it, and I called him, for like 5 days later. It's like, how many versions of the head? It's like, how do you know? Like, how many versions? Like I'm on number 12. Okay, I'm going to send you an email. So I sent him the head, and he was like, I fucking hate you. The first one was the best. Like, that's the only thing I wanted to say. I rest my case, Your Honor. So,
Yeah.
and he stopped doing it, because he realized I couldn't separate myself from the work until you sent me that head, and I realized I did that 5 days ago.
Yeah. One of the reasons why I've generally been happy doing a lot of mainstream comics is that the deadlines are difficult, which has made it hard to fall into those kind of traps.
Yeah.
I know that my color artist needs to get this page on his desk so he can color it, and the letterer needs to get it on his page so he can letter it. So whatever guilt I would feel about neglecting the opportunity to make this a perfect picture is balanced out by the guilt I would feel by ruining this person's life, by making him cancel his dinner plans or his vacation.
Absolutely.
That sense of responsibility can help you escape a lot of OCD traps.
Absolutely. And there's also the part about we were talking before about the muscles for comedy and the muscles for drama. But when you're working on create your own, as compared to working on work for hire, it's a different set of muscles because it's your own stuff as compared to company stuff, or is it the same one, just the same ones, just used in a different way?
For me, it's almost always the same muscles. A long time ago, I stopped doing pencils for my editors to look at. I sent them fully inked pages because if I'm worried about what somebody else wants when I'm working on the page, it takes all the joy out of it. It just goes away. I'd rather draw something new than take feedback in the middle of it. I don't want to have to draw it twice, once to explain and then another time to actually do it. But aside from that, whether I own it or not, creatively, I can't tell myself, well, this is for them, so I'm going to think like them. I have to attack the page as if it's as if it's my own story, as if it means me. And then you hand your baby over to Dark Side and let him raise it.
You put your. I was meaning more about when you do your own work, when you do, the company work, the work for hire. You have a safety net in a way, which is, you have the editor, you have the. That universe that's been created for 60, 70, 80 years. So, there's a lot of stuff you just can, try and get to help you tell those stories. But in your own stuff, like Whiteout, etc., it's yours. It's from the get-go. There's no safety net. So that's what I meant in terms of if there's a different mentality of set of muscles, because in one way, okay, there's some stuff that I can pick to help me, and in the other stuff there's nothing I can get to pick me because this is my universe. It's my whole universe. I created it from scratch.
It's a good question. I think there's probably a reason why in fact, almost everything I've done that's creator-owned has been stories that are mostly set in the real world. The creating fantasy elements has never been that interesting to me. The designing wild costumes or science fiction setting, it's never called me as an artist. So I think when I'm doing my own stuff, I gravitate towards drawing people and places and ideas and images that already exist in the real world and interpreting those rather than rather than building a new world. Yeah, I've got no Mobius in me whatsoever.
Yeah, but the world, even if it's a real world, it's your own world. It's, I mean, it's not a world that's been set up by somebody else. It's something that you have to make consistent from the get-go for yourself without any external help, right?
Well, I construct the feeling of that world, but I think my stuff is strongest when my drawings feel like they were observed.
Makes sense. Makes perfect sense. Makes perfect
Yeah.
sense. Pedro also asked, how are you going to work again with Nick Spencer? The fixed and superior foes were delightful.
I don't know. I loved working with Nick and collaborating with him on those books. At a certain point, it happens with a lot of people that Nick works with. They just stop getting email. He just stops answering emails, and you're not sure why. And that's what happened with the fix. The last I heard was more script coming, and then that was it. So if he was to finish writing it, I'd love to draw it. But at this point, I don't see him doing that. I think he's moved on to other things.
Okay. Speaking as a comic book artist, what are some useful things comic book writers should know to make the collaboration go smoothly?
Good question. The answer varies for a lot of different artists, but speaking very generally, you want to write visually without calling shots, and I'll explain what I mean by both those things. Writing visually means telling your story in a way that makes its points with things with pictures rather than with words. An example of that from I guess it was from Breaking Bad. You're seeing your T-shirt there. They did a scene where a guy who's making a drug run between the countries would stop off and get his truck filled up with drugs. And while he was there, he would get like some ice cream on a stick, and he would finish it, and he would put that stick into the dirt when he was done. And they pulled the camera back and showed hundreds of those sticks in the dirt, which told you that he's made that trip hundreds of times. You could have done that with dialogue. You could have one person say, "Hello, Bill. How often have you and your truck made this drive back and forth?" And he would say, "Oh, I have made this drive hundreds of times." But the character wouldn't talk about that. Yeah. He would keep his mouth shut. So you need a way to communicate that information simply and visually and interestingly. Yeah. And that's a bit of visual storytelling. What you don't want to do, generally speaking, is tell your artist, put the camera 2 feet behind this character's head, and have him standing with his right arm in the air and his left arm on the table. You don't want to micromanage the architecture of a panel. The rule that I usually give writers, the suggestion I usually give writers is tell your artist one fact and one feeling for each panel. What is the fact that's being communicated by this panel? What's the visual idea, the reason for this panel to be there in the story? And what does it feel like? Is it a scary moment? Is it a funny moment? Is the character feeling ironic? Are they feeling offended? Are they enraged? One fact, one feeling, and that'll give your artist everything they need to know to tell the story properly.
And it's also about something that I talk to writers constantly. It's about feeling your artist too, right? I mean, not writing the same for every artist, just talk to the artist, know their fortes, their strengths, what they don't like to draw. But it's also about, reading their work and seeing what you need to add in terms of information, what you need not to put there, because the artist prefers to put it himself, right, or herself.
Oh, very much so. And there's a lot of different ways to work with Nick. Nick was very generous with letting me come up with stuff. I had a script from him that said maybe something funny happens with the wings. That was the whole script for the page. And because he knew I loved coming up with gags for this character with wings who didn't know how to control them and would smack and would break things in the room with them. So from that one sentence, I did a 16-panel page, and it's one of my favorite pages of the comic. It was great to do. I did a Conan story that had a script that said pages 14 through 17 they fight. And so that's what I drew.
What we call the Stanley way.
Yeah, exactly. And the script I think it was originally written for John Romita Jr. And
that explains a lot. Yeah.
I spoke to the writer and he said, I'm not gonna tell John Romita Jr. what should happen in a fight. Whatever he comes up with is going to be better than what I come up with. And so you come up with that. Working with Matt Fraction on Jimmy Olsen, Matt knows exactly what he wants, precisely what he wants. So he writes very detailed scripts. He doesn't usually call shots, but occasionally he's got a really specific idea of what he wants. Matt also thinks about rhythm the same obsessive way that I do. So he usually will tell you how many rows of panels are on each page, and which row a set of gags or a set of panels should be in. And I always have the freedom to change it, but anything I never once came up with anything better than what he was asking for. If you've talked to David Aha, I'm sure he can tell you a similar experience. He thinks about rhythm, and he's so many ideas that I could be more of I could be just a craftsman and execute his ideas, and it would have been a terrific comic.
Yeah, but could that be frustrating for you as an artist? I mean, to just be that. I'm not saying that's the case with Matt, because I know it's not. But but if you have a writer that considers you his tool to just tell the story and control it in such a way where you don't have any freedom, wouldn't that be, as a comic artist, because you're a storyteller first, you're not a guy who just draws pictures. So as a storyteller, wouldn't just be frustrating and kill your joy as an artist?
It could be, it only if it wasn't good. so long as the page that's growing in front of me is good, I don't care where the ideas are coming from, so long as I'm getting to execute good ideas.
Makes sense. Makes sense.
If the stuff is bad, it's agonizing no matter how much control I have.
Well, but if you have a lot of control, at least you can change it.
I've like every artist, I've had scripts where my main job as an artist is to control the bleeding. I'm here to sew up the wound. And it's demoralizing because frankly, a shitty script with lots of freedom is a lot more work than an incredibly detailed script that's also good. And
you're not going to be paid for it to fix the script anyway. So that happens a lot when artists tell me, you know what, when I was younger, I've spent a lot of time, fixing bad scripts. But it gets to a point when you're old enough to realize this is not my work, and I'm not going to get paid for it. So I just do the work, and then consider it a day and say it's a bad day. Well, tomorrow will be a better day. We'll get a better script, or we just go on to another book. So this doesn't happen to me again.
Yeah, yeah.
Tell me if you agree with this. I've been telling that for me, comic book storytelling should be taught in school from primary school. Like my daughter is 7 years old now, and I talk to her a lot about storytelling, and she loves when I explain, for example, to look between the panels. Always, I tell her, I put one panel, cover the next one, and tell me what's going to happen. Right, because of what happened, of that space, and that's why she learned to read comics really, really fast. And of course, we have the joke about this is Clark Kent. We don't need the rest. The next panel is going to be him flying. It's not going to be him running, him opening the arm, him doing this, him jumping. No, it's just open. Next, it's flying. So I always say that comic book readers, we have a superpower, which is the moment you learn how to read comics. If you watch a movie, you read a magazine, you read a newspaper, you watch the news, we never, ever take anything for granted. We automatically look for what's between the panels, read between the lines, look for the news and say, there's something behind it. Mm-hmm. Because that's what comics teach us, to read, to look for what's not there. What do you think about that?
I don't know. I've never raised kids myself, so I've been one. I was a kid once.
Okay, that's a good starting point.
Yeah, I started out as a child, so I'm the last person to ask about what's the best way to teach.
Okay, so you know the part about teaching, but what do you think about that part that I told you about, the superpowers or that quality that you get as a comic reader? To look, how do you look at culture, if you want to call it like that, or you look at art?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, my own journey with comics, I was so obsessed with them so young that it's hard for me to imagine how anybody else starts to engage with them. Mm-hmm. I was very lucky that, like I said, that the only comic books I was allowed to buy, I had to buy used, at garage sales, and junk stores and things. That meant a couple of things. Meant I got a big variety of comics because mm-hmm. It was just whatever didn't sell, whatever someone didn't want to keep, that was the one I was allowed to get. So I read a bunch of different kinds, and it also meant that if a story was continued in another comic book, I didn't get to see it. Mm-hmm. So if I had part 2, I had no idea what happened in part 1. So a big part of my time reading comics wasn't just making the leap from panel to panel. It was thinking about the other parts of the story that I would never get to read. Mm-hmm. So my mind was always very engaged by that. The other comic that was really important to me as a child, aside from the ones in the funnies in the newspaper, mm-hmm. Was I had a subscription to a children's magazine that I'd gotten as a gift from my grandmother, and the magazine was serializing 1010 Cigars of the Pharaoh. Mm-hmm. It was in English. I had no idea this was a Belgian comic. All I knew it was interesting, and it didn't look like any other comic book I'd ever seen. It mm-hmm. was in black and white, and it was beautiful and strange, and it was adventure, but it wasn't the kind of adventure that I was reading in Marvel comics. And I think that diagrammatic clarity of Ergue's work, that the cool distant remove from things, mm-hmm. I think that taught me a lot about how to read pictures, because his stuff, he does show you every step of the way. You would see Clark Kent take off his hat. You would see him unbutton his coat. You would see the coat come off, and I think that taught my brain to make up all those pictures in the middle on its own.
Did you guys? You just mentioned tinting. Did you guys have tinting in mind at all when you were doing Jimmy Olsen?
Yes.
Because for us here in Europe, the moment issue 1 was released, people started comparing it, saying these guys had to have tinting in mind when they did this. But saying it in a good way, like happy about it, not, oh, they're plagiarizing. No, people was like, oh my God, this makes all the sense in the world.
Yeah, well, let me see if I can find a page here. Hold on. We drew the comic out of order. As folks who read it may know, the comic is made up of 3- and 4-page stories that are not in
sequence.
Linear. Yeah. And we moved those around a lot before the comic was actually published. So one of the first pages we drew in the comic ran in issue 6 or 7. I'm flipping through it now, trying to find the page. Let's see. I think I've... Sorry for wasting people's time here.
Nah, don't worry, we're fine. We're fine. If they're here, they have patience.
Yeah. Aha. Yes, got it. Yeah. Let's see. There we go.
Yes.
Yeah, that was the second page I drew of that comic. We wanted to tip our hat. We didn't try to consciously do that, but it's an important influence. And, it's the boy reporter. How could you not think about that when thinking about Jimmy Olsen?
Absolutely. Look, Henk Lie, who's a comic store owner in Amsterdam, he's saying, "Hi guys, big fans here in Amsterdam of Steve's work. The Lazarus TPs keep on selling well, and we saw a fixed TP Volume 1 earlier today. One of my favorites of Steve is Steel Whiteout."
Thank you very much. Whiteout was the comic book that changed everything for me. I mentioned earlier that it's the one where I finally figured out how to make comics that looked like me, that had my ideas and worked the way I meant them to. I still love the story. I love the character. For folks who don't know what I'm talking about, here it is.
Yes.
And I hope to work with Greg again someday. He lives about 10 blocks that way. So but once things are not crazy again, I can stop by and say hello. And yeah, his story was just a huge pleasure to draw.
But you guys, Whiteout is done, right? You mean to work with him again in something new, or you still think that you could go back to that? Because I thought that was done with the last series.
Back in 2007, we started a third Whiteout book. I've got 33 pages sitting in a drawer a few feet from me. But Greg ran out of steam on the story. He thought he had a story in mind, and then when I drew the last page that he had scripted, he realized that the story he had didn't work, and he was never able to figure out what to do with it.
Ouch.
But yeah, there's 33 lettered pages sitting in a drawer, just
Well, you can always publish those pages in a big, whiteout anniversary edition, like extras or something like that.
Yeah, I guess it would be more DVD extras.
Yeah, that's what I
Yeah.
meant. Yeah. Greg Gostini says, going back to the music analogy, what are some of the biggest influences on your work that are not comics?
A couple of musicians, a punk band from the 80s, the Dead Kennedys, was they have very, very visual lyrics, for lack of a better way to describe it. The lead singer and songwriter Jello Biafra wrote very, very powerful satirical imagery into his songs. I think about those kind of storytelling strategies a lot. And another person, John Darnell of the band The Mountain Goats, uses metaphor in a really powerful way throughout his stuff, and gets a lot of power by using song structures that don't match the feeling of the story he's telling at all. And it's again, I'm back to the stoner roommate waving my hands. There's a really powerful impact that can come when a story or an image or a concept attacks you from an angle you're not expecting, because the package that it's wrapped in, the feeling of the song, is so unlike the message it's carrying. I learned a lot from that. Another band that influences my story a lot. John Layman and I are the only two people on Earth who like this band, and who both consider it an important influence on our comics. The band is called Alice Donut, and they were big in the New York art rock punk scene in like the 80s and 90s. And what they did with their stuff is use stuff that's influenced by power chords and heavy metal and all the sorts of power fantasy riffs of rock and roll, and use it to tell stories about being powerless, about having no control of the things in your life, about life being this mess that you can't possibly have any control over. And it's that same sort of package of subversion that I find really interesting.
And we're talking about music now. We keep going back to music, guys, as you can see. What is your soundtrack while you work? Do you have maybe you are in layouts, you need absolute silence because you're composing the pages, and then if you're going to a more mechanical, between brackets, part of work, you can listen to music. What is it for you? How is the method?
I can listen to almost except for the part where I'm thumbnailing, where I'm actually reading the words on the script and thinking about what those words mean and what the story I'm telling. For that, I need silence. For everything else, it doesn't matter what. After 19 years of working in Helioscope with 20 artists in the room with me, all of them talking and listening to their own music, there's no noise that can knock me out of my zone.
And do you adapt the music you listen to the scene you want to tell? I mean, if it's epic, you're Lord of the Rings. So if it's romantic, you go with classic music, or it doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter. It could be a podcast. It could be an old punk album. It could be classical. It could be jazz. It could be it could be a local radio station. It could be audio from It just doesn't matter.
Stoner Chase, I think that you, in a way, you answered the question already. But Whiteout was a very important comic. Now that time has passed, how do you see it?
It rescued me from the toilet of obscurity. Yeah, it saved my career, and it convinced me that that I had a future, and that I could actually make comics that I liked.
How important are page turns for you, if they are important?
Very important. We've talked a lot about how important rhythm is to me, and the rhythm of the page turn is one of the biggest rhythms of a comic. Knowing that there's that pause, that intake breath of where they're not going to get any information, and now they've got more information. It's huge. It's one of the reasons why I've never really played around much in webcomics or that infinite scroll kind of space, because it's a rhythm that I haven't even thought about, and I feel like I'd be starting from scratch. A good friend of mine who was in the studio for a long time, Dan Scotty, does a wonderful scrolling webcomic on Webtoons, and he put the work in and really thought about how to tell comics that don't have page turns, that just have scrolling reveals, and I read his stuff, and it feels entirely new to me. It's as exciting as reading Harvey Kurtzman's stuff was the first time I read it, where you're seeing, oh, this is a person who knows exactly how this stuff works.
And do you think that can be adapted in a way? Because I've seen some creators who talk about webtoons and say, no, then after doing it, I can just grab the panels and put them in order and adapt them. When I don't really agree on that. I just think it's two different. It's comics, of course. I think both are comics. Yeah. I'm not going to argue that, but I think it's two different languages. So if you try to adapt one to each other, you just kill it. What do you think about that?
I think you would have to. It would be adapting. It would be adapting the same way adapting the script is for translating a comic.
Yeah.
Except instead of a translator, it would be, instead of a linguist being the translator, a graphic designer would have to be the translator.
Yeah.
It's what can I take with this scroll? How can I slice it up so that the rhythms still have an impact that are effective? And it's going to be a different set of rhythms.
Yeah.
It's just can I make it work? And a good designer can. You may wind up with some very weird pages. You may wind up with pages where there's 2/3 white space because this to land properly, this tiny little slice needs to be on its own page. But as an active translation, it's a bunch of problems to solve.
Yeah, it would be an interesting conundrum. I'm not denying that, but if you're thinking about doing a page, a physical or digital page, but a page, for a comic that's going to be published on paper, by the end of the day, you have to think about what's going to be the focus panel, what's going to be, the establishing shot. How can we get from the establishing shot to the close-up? As I always teach, the young guys, as a rule, between brackets, is the first thing that I try to teach them in storytelling is try to get me in the page from one establishing shot to a close-up shot. I want all the steps. I want you to, try distances and angles so you see you can do it and how the language works. That's completely different in webtoons. I mean, every panel has to be a focus panel. How do you translate that into a physical page, right?
Yeah, and I don't know. Someone's going to surprise us and show that they and crack the code and figure out how to do it. Albeit, I don't know if Dan Scotty plans to do a print version. If he does, he's going to be one of those guys who's thinking about that, and maybe doing some radical things to what he'd already created to make it work. rather, but if you were to just lift it and paste it down, it would be meaningless.
Yeah, I know that I have Jeff Smith, who did that 2K, I think, on Webtoons first, and now he has, that he has the graphic novel on Kickstarter, and he told me that literally he had to redo it from scratch. Like, I wanted to do it, move it from Webtoons, adapt it and all that. Like, no, I had to redo it from scratch. It just didn't work.
Yeah. I've spoken to people about people who want to print a bunch of storyboards and call it a comic book, and that's not how it works. No,
but that's
they may look like
please.
The storyboards may look like panels from a comic, but they're not. They're a set of instructions for somebody to tell a story in a way that's very different from comics. And it's if someone doesn't grasp that difference, it's hard to communicate to them why there is a difference or that it's there.
But that's how when people tries to do comics now, but not do comics, just having the script or the art, whatever, to be a sample for a producer to buy it and to do a movie or to do a TV show. I always tell the people who want to do that, like, editors, artists, and writers, we know. The first second we saw this, we know that's not a comic and it stinks. So it's not going to get past. Nobody's going to publish it. And if they publish it, it's going to be a bad comic. And then a producer is going to grab it and is going to try to read it as a comic. And it's not going to buy it as a movie because it could be a really bad comic. And they want a good comic as the basis to what they buy. They don't want the bad comic. Like, oh, this is such a really horrible comic. I'm going to make a movie out of it. No, they want the good comics, right?
Yeah. Different medium, different set of tools. And if they don't get it, you can't tell them. They just have to see something fail.
Absolutely. How important is for you to give the reader let me say it this way. I love pattern recognition, and I love the fact when you give the reader. I think comics is the best in terms of suggesting things. I just give you this and this, and if it was a drawing, you could know that's Batman because I just need the ear and the cape. I don't need to complete it. So how important it is for you to know as an artist that you need to leave a space for the reader to complete things to make the experience more enjoyable?
That goes back to what I was talking about when I said that comedy made me a better artist. I didn't used to trust. I don't know if I was failing to trust my reader that they can fill those in, or if I was failing to trust myself that I could put enough into the panel for them to put all the pieces together. But I think it's hugely important for the experience of reading a comic to leave room for the reader's imagination to finish the story. I think a completed illustration, while it's an admirable and beautiful thing by itself, in the context of a comic, can lay there like a dead fish. Some of my favorite adventure comics when I was a kid were Joe Kubert's. I eventually went to his school. He was an important influence on me. And Jeff Parker and I talk about this all the time, how we remember looking at these Tarzan comics and seeing magnificent jeweled cities and armies of fierce warriors. And then when we look at the comic, and that jeweled city is 14 lines. There's a little suggestion of a castle and some squiggles of greenery surrounding it, but our minds had done the work of finishing that picture and making it a gleaming city in the jungle. But what was there was so thoroughly imagined, and not imagined in terms of meticulous detail on the page, but imagined in terms of what the moment felt like. That everything that was important about the moment was communicated to us, and then we did the rest of the work. And became co-authors of the readers become co-authors of the story there, and then they really get invested in it.
And that's also a really big part of the art of telling comics, right? Which is not tiring the reader with so many details. I always say, read the script, and it says, "Oh, there's like 100 warriors," and then the artist tries to do the 100 heads, and I always say, you don't need to do the 100 heads. You need to do the like maybe 10, 12 in the forefront, and then the rest you just do the heads. And the reader's brain is going to complete it. You don't need to do the whole thing. If you like to do it, if you're Jeff Darrow or Travis Charest or somebody like that, fine, that's your style. But don't think you need it. You just need to trust your reader, and his brain is going to complete it without us giving him the whole detail, right?
Yeah, and when I'm talking about this to the mentees at my studio, what I tell them is your unit of production is a story.
Yeah.
It's not a panel.
All
the decisions you're making are being made to tell a whole story. If you're looking at it and thinking, I have drawn a magnificent panel, that is, then you're not thinking about the sweep of the whole thing. And it's a hard lesson for a young artist to learn. And it takes so much work to get good enough to do a detailed panel. It's so much work just to get there, and then to feel like you have to. Oh, I've done all this, and now I have to throw those skills away and start thinking about it in a different way. It's hard. It's a lot to ask an artist to give up. And some never do. I mean, for some folks that becomes all they want. But I find that as a reader, I've never been more engaged as much as I love Jeff Darrow's brain and his ability to conceive of things. I've never been as engaged by a Jeff Darrow comic as I have by a Charles Schultz comic.
Yeah, but because in a way, what we're discussing is the unit is not the panel. The unit is the page, and part of the mission as a storyteller, the big part of the mission as a storyteller is to draw the eye of the reader by the diagonal from point A to point C, depending on the number of panels. You know what I mean? From one point to the next. And that only works if you consider the page the unit, right? Not the panel. If you think about all in the panels, if you give it everything the same importance, you are not letting the reader navigate, right?
Correct. And there's a lot of different ways to think about that. Joe Kubert was very, very enamored of. He really liked doing pages where there's one major image on each page that was kind of this panel will be larger because it's the emotional focus of the page, and for the kind of heightened melodrama that he worked in, that was the way to work. You wanted the sense of an airplane swooping through the sky, and the emotional explosion that's Tarzan beating his chest and doing the Tarzan scream after he's just broken a gorilla's neck in a wrestling match. And for other kind of stories, if you're telling a Charlie Brown story, you don't want one giant panel. it would kill the rhythm. When I switched to comedy, I found that I couldn't do those big panels much anymore because they almost always killed the rhythms of the joke. Once in a while in Superior Foes, the punchline of a joke would be that that Boomerang used the jets on his boots to go flying out of a scene, and so I'd pull the camera back and do a big panel of him flying over the whole city or something like that. But for a lot of jokes, you had to deliberately make the layouts as boring as possible. Square panel, square panel, square panel, square panel, because it's the comics equivalent of a deadpan comedian. That's when, yeah, that's a comedian who always keeps their face like this, rather than telling you that something's funny by smiling and being emotional about it.
Yeah, absolutely. But at the end of the day, it's all about, in a big way, it's all about clarity, right? About guiding your reader in the most, not easy, but in the most easy to follow way, depending on what you want to tell. As you said, if you want to tell the joke, square, 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 and then the punchline. But if Joe used to do, if you wanted to, superheroes or whatever, it's going to be, you need a big focus panel that gives you the big punch, right? So it also depends on the kind of story you want to tell. That's how you have to guide the reader. You cannot use the same tool for every story, right?
Right. And you were talking about types of music earlier. Superhero and adventure comics work best if you approach them like opera. There's very, very quiet places, and there's places where the drummers are pounding and the tubas are going. Yeah, you want the very, very quiet and the hugely loud.
Absolutely. Felipe González Hernandez says, I have arrived late. Nah, there's no late here, don't worry. Many thanks for your work, Steve. My first comic book with your art was Image Anthology with Underworld, and later the limited series. After that, I have followed you in so many amazing comics.
Oh, thank you. Underground is going to be republished this year by Oni Press. Jeff Parker and I wanted to bring that back into print, so we talked to Oni, and they'll be republishing it. We fiddled with a little bit and went back and cleaned up a few mistakes that had been bugging us for 10 years. And, other than that, it's unchanged. I have a lot of affection for that comic, and I'm eager to see it back. Interestingly, it was never published in any language aside from English, but there is an authorized bootleg Spanish translation that you can find on the internet. I had put Underground out as a pay what you want, download it for free thing. And if you want to send a tip, go ahead and send it. So it was on the web like that for a while. And a woman who's a Spanish comics letterer and translator, whose name I cannot remember. I apologize for that if you're watching now. Hello. She contacted me and asked, she wanted to do a translation of the comic as a portfolio sample. Could she do that and put it on the web? And I said, sure. So if you search around, you could probably find the authorized illegal Spanish edition and read it.
Yeah, but let's hope that when you guys, publish this new edition, somebody publishes in Spanish, as a real, actual physical book.
It would be lovely if it happens. I never expect these things. It's always it's often a surprise. Marvel never tells you anything about whether something's been translated or not. And you don't get paid, and you don't find out about it. You just eventually you visit the country and you're citing comics you didn't know exist. DC will sometimes get you a copy of the things, and they'll pay you for it, which is very nice.
And if DC doesn't send it to you, my wife will.
Oh, that's lovely.
Because she's the marketing director for ECC Comics, who's the publisher of DC Comics in Spain. Remember that, and Spanish-speaking South America. Yeah. So normally creators just contact her. It's like, hey, you know what? Can you send me a copy? And like, yeah, of course.
Great. Yeah. I know they've been doing Jimmy Olsen, because I've heard from a lot of fans in Spain, and I'm always curious because translating comics is hard in any instance, but translating jokes, there's cultural references, there's rhythms, there's so many more problems to solve, and I don't know how.
When I was translating comics years ago, when I still had time in my life, I had to translate for a while Deadpool, and the translation for Deadpool, basically I told the editor, look, I'm not going to translate, I am going to adapt. And he was like, why? Because if I translate it as it is, Nobody's gonna laugh. It's not going to make sense. It's too local. I need to, adapt it. I'm going to talk to Joe because he was Joe Kelly, and I'm going to talk to the Ray, and I'm going to tell him, I'm going to translate it this way. So if anybody tells you, because people is assholes and they're going to do it, they say, oh no, he changed your joke. Just so you know, I have to change it because in Spanish that joke wouldn't make sense at all. Yeah. So I talked to him, and then he did translation. People was telling me, oh my God, that's so funny. And I was like, okay, thank you. But that's just so you know, that wasn't the original joke. If you want to read in English, it's a really good experience because that's how you see that comedy needs to be adapted. When they did in Spain the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, they tried to do it the first time. They dubbed it, and they dubbed it with original jokes. And nobody watched it because it was, local jokes about LA, about the street, culture in Philadelphia and all that. So they did a new dubbing that it was literally changing all the jokes to adapt it to the Spanish people, to the Spanish audience. And it was the most watched show for like 6 years.
That's great.
The only way to make it work was to adapt it because the original jokes, if they are local, you just can't make them work.
Yeah, I know that here in the U.S., we waited for about 2 decades for a complete translation of Munoz and Sampaio's Sinner.
Yeah, I like Sinner.
Because there was one chapter in there where there's a puppet show, and every line of dialogue, every single line is an elaborate pun. And Kim Thompson, it just took him forever to figure out how to make everything work. It's just a backbreaking amount of work. Or I read that with the Asterix books, they have to do the same thing that you talked about with Deadpool. They just write new jokes. There's
because
no way to...
because the Asterix books also, for some people, not for me, I don't give a shit. But there's people who finds them offensive, because the jokes are really French, looking above your shoulder and thinking the rest of the world is shit. Literally, like we are the French, high and mighty, the rest are crap. So if you read Asterix in Hispania, which is Spain, it's all jokes, of course, about flamenco and bullfighting and all that, and you're like, leave me alone. That's not who we are. So people changed, some of the translation, so it didn't was so offensive. And same with the other countries. Every edition of, Asterix in Switzerland, the Swiss people changed the dialogue. In other countries they changed the dialogue, and I was like, why? Why could you do that? If you don't like it, don't buy it, but don't take it, from people the experience of how it's written. The joke is not about, the joke is not going to be understood. In this case was, where's the limit of humor?
Right.
If it can be offensive, and I was like, of course they made it offensive. That was in purpose. So that's part of the intention. If you take it away, you're killing the joke. Yeah.
And so much stuff can happen in the process of translation. I was just talking with a friend. There's a book that came out in Argentina in I think the 70s. It was a communist book called "How to Read Donald Duck," and it's a book written from a Marxist perspective, talking about the Uncle Scrooge comics, the Karl Barks stuff, as if it was consciously written to be Western propaganda, and they didn't know that while the assumptions or the ideas may have reinforced that, Carl wasn't working for the Pentagon. He was just some crazy little guy with a hearing aid living in rural Oregon, drawing stories with no feedback from his editor and mailing them in. But they analyzed these things, and I had seen there's an English translation of this book that also they instead of going back to the original comics, they translated the Spanish translations of the English comics back into English. So you had 2 levels of separation. And one of the great examples of where things got weird was there's a comic that in the original American comic book, you have the nephews, Huey, Dewey, and Louie, saying they're talking about some Native Americans, some indigenous people. We're going to teach them square dancing. And when it got translated twice into Spanish and then back into English, it turned into, we're going to teach them how to march in a line. And you can see how the steps that it took to get there, but it's a very different impact.
Yeah, that's the risk. That's the risk you take every time you translate. There's a risk. I remember I got chastised, and it was really funny. I honestly couldn't stop laughing because I had to translate for classics of DC Comics. It was New Teen Titans issue 1, okay, and or issue 2, whatever. And they were talking about Star Wars on the context, of having it watched on the theater when it was released or something like that. And when it was released in Spain for the first time, just so you see, where let me find it. Now it's my turn to find things. Now that's Superman. Where? Here you are. When it was originally released in Spain, that it wasn't Star Wars. It was La Guerra de las Galaxias, this Galaxy Wars. They didn't want to call it La Guerra de las Estrellas, which is Star Wars, because Star Trek back in the day in Spain the translation was something like that, like Travel to the Stars. So they were like, let's make it some difference. So when I translated the comic book, since it was supposed to be, they're talking in that era when this was released, I translated it as, we went to the theater to watch La Guerra de las Galaxias. And people was like, no, that's a mistake, it's Star Wars. And I had a laugh and I had to explain, go back in time, look at when, New Teen Titans issue 1 was released and see how people was calling the movie back at that moment. And a lot of people was telling me, oh my God, that's some research. And I was like, no, that's not research. I was alive when it happened.
Yeah,
and I know that in that era, when my older brothers had the VHS, it wasn't called the Star Wars in Spain. It was called La Guerra de las Galaxias. And I have the original LP, but motherfuckers. So that happens a lot, if you want to put things into context and people lives in the moment, they don't realize that back then it wasn't called that way. So it adds a level of fun, when you do translations that I miss, but also I don't miss everything that you said about, all those levels where you have to play with. I don't miss it at all. I don't miss translating at all because you want a pain in the ass. Let me be completely honest.
Yeah, a huge amount of work. Nobody appreciates if you do a perfect job, everyone thinks that the original writer is the genius.
Yeah.
And if you do it badly, everyone hates you.
And also, let's be completely honest, it's paid like crap.
Yeah.
Really, really badly. Yeah. So by the end of the day, when you realize how much time you've been using for that's when I decided to start translating. Like, I'm using that much time for this amount of money. You know what? My headaches are not worth it. I'm going to spend more time with my wife. To be completely. A couple more questions and I'll let you go because I've had you already like 1 hour and 38 minutes. And you probably need to go back to your life, to work, to rest, to sit down even. So
I have to go fry an egg, but yes.
Okay. So
go right there.
Two more things. One, how important is silence for you to tell a story? To take your time and they say like, we're going really fast. It's time for some quiet to let the reader reflect or yourself, to change the pace of a story.
Inside the story, hugely important. In the area around me where I'm creating, I'm terrified of it. Because I work in a studio full of other artists for so long, that being in a room by myself without noise, it makes me worried that I've fallen off the planet and that I'm living in the apocalypse and there's nobody left. I need that reassuring input of sound and real life around me.
In that sense, I gotta add, I always say that I am the fifth of 5 brothers. So you can imagine that in my father's apartment, silence didn't exist. So every time I have silence, I need noise, I need cacophony. Because if I don't, I think, Jack Torrance from The Signing is going to come behind my back with a knife and is going to kill me.
Mm-hmm.
So I need noise. I think that's the same case for you. But I was asking more in terms of a story, in terms of when you're telling a story in a comic.
I love silent panels. I love those pauses. I love them rhythmically. I love what it does to a reader when you throw the rhythm of that they're reading off, because they'll read a lot of passages with a lot of words, and I found that readers, when they're reading a comic book, they don't really look at the pictures. They read the captions and the word balloons, and they just sort of absorb what's in the picture while they're reading those words.
Mm-hmm.
It's another reason why I've started cleaning my drawings so that they read with as much clarity as the instructions for how to escape a crashing airplane.
Mm-hmm.
I want that information to just burn into the brain rather than requiring people to study the panel to see what's happening. But when you take the words away, it forces people to actually study the picture. And there's times when I want to take advantage of that, and I love the impact it could have. And musically, it's like the part in the song where everybody else stops playing except for one instrument or the vocalist.
Mm-hmm.
And it's, you can think of all the places where where the whole band is playing, then all of a sudden it's just the drummer hitting one note, and it creates a whole new world inside the song just by giving you less.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And my last question: is there any stories that you've consciously or unconsciously stopped yourself from telling, thinking, you know what, I'm not ready? That is in your drawer, but it's like, yeah, I'm gonna do it, but you don't find that exact thing that makes it work, and you keep delaying it, but you think sooner or later, before I retire, before I die, whatever, one or the other, this story is going to be told. It's a story that has always been there, that is going to be done sooner or later.
Yeah, I haven't done nearly as much writing as I should have,
Mm-hmm.
and part of it is that I've oriented my career to be someone who draws other people's stories, and part of it has been cowardice. Part of it has been that there's no deadline pressure to write for me to write stuff that nobody's asking me for, and also some things that I just wasn't ready to tell or to talk about. Every once in a while, I'll do a small autobiographical comic and put it on my Twitter account, where I draw it very rawly in pencil. I don't erase any construction things, so people can just see it. I told one friend that when I do that, I do those for the same reason that people in musicals start to sing. They say in a stage musical, in a musical comedy or whatever, the characters start singing when the emotions are too big for just normal speaking to carry that moment, and that's how I am with personal cartooning, and I need to do more of that, and I should do more of that, but I just haven't for a number of reasons. And yeah, there are some things I've wanted to talk about and wanted to tell, but I haven't had a context for it.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so 1 hour and 44 minutes. So I think that's so
that's good.
Thank you so much. No, thank you so much.
Yeah.
Please talk. You first.
I wanted to thank everyone for listening to me go on and on and on for such a long time. I apologize for taking up that much of your day.
No, not at all. I just gotta tell you, with Scott McCloud, we were here for more than 3 hours.
Okay.
So you're fine. You're in the average, honestly, between 144 and between 2 hours. I speak a lot. I speak too much, honestly. So that's not use me. So thank you so much for being here, Steve. Above all, you're a master. You're amazing. I miss you, and I hope to see you really soon again when this crap is over. And to all of you, thank you for being here. Thank you for your comments. Thank you for your kindness. Thank you for your time. Wear a mask. Remember, we're still not out of the woods. We're still being vaccinated. We have to care for people. We have to be decent. Wear your mask. Again, don't be an asshole. Okay? So,
and one more thing for me. If I don't know if my name is down here.
It is. Yeah. Where your finger is now. There.
Yeah. If I missed, if you have a question that in the chat that I missed, feel free to write me on Twitter. I'll be happy to answer it there.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I think we went through all of them, but just in case, and if you have any other questions, that's it. Go, chase him. He said he would answer. So take care of you, and we'll be back on Thursday. Estaremos de vuelta el jueves con Enrique Sánchez Abulí, with Enrique Sánchez Abulí, co-creator of Torpedo, 1936, co-creador de Torpedo con Alex Toth, later with Jordi Bernet, etc. One of those amazing comics that Steve loves.
Maestro dibujante.
So we're off. We're leaving in 3,